Thank you very much. It is my absolute pleasure and honour to be here with you today. I want to first of all thank the Ministry and BC3 for counting on us as well to organise and co-organise this panel. We've heard from Minister Ribera that two of the key Spanish priorities are to reindustrialise the EU and foster open strategic autonomy, as well as to foster the green transition and enable environmental adaptation. She's also pointed out that we cannot do this alone. In terms of climate, we are 8% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. We also have very high dependence on critical raw materials. We know that the financing of just the European Green Deal and Repower EU is going to entail at least 620 billion annually extra. Additionally, we know that we have calls for appeasing or reducing regulatory inflation and the willingness of citizens to accept the internalisation of environmental externalities is in short supply. So given all of this, in this panel, we seek to understand how we can govern the geopolitics of net zero transition and what the European Union's role is in all of this. So this panel will discuss elements of both the internal and external dimensions of the European Green Deal, which will include the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the EU-Mercosur trade deal, the Net Zero Industry Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, and anything and everything related to COP, which is the multilateral fora where we are, as Valvanera also pointed out, where we need to advance and give that guiding star and not only follow the guiding star of the Paris Agreement, but also shape it and make it more concrete and come out of the COP28 with both mitigation, adaptation, finance, and also the technical details of Article 6 on carbon markets, because if we don't make that robust, it's going to be very difficult to deliver on our Paris Agreement goals. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you a stellar panel of speakers. We will first of all have Professor Sebastian Oberter, who's the Director of the Centre for Environment, Economy and Energy at the Brussels School of Governance at the VUB, and Professor of Environmental Policy and Law at the University of East Finland. You probably know Professor Oberter's work, but he deals with issues of international environmental and climate policy. He's done that for many, many years. He's currently coordinating the Jean Monnet network governing the EU's transition towards climate neutrality and sustainability, the Green Deal Net, and we had a great meeting earlier on in September this year. Professor Gonzalo Escribano, he's the Director of the Energy and Climate Programme at Elcano Royal Institute. He's also full Professor of Economic Policy at the Department of Applied Economics at the Spanish Open University, Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia. He's a leading scholar in energy geopolitics and governance, and he lectures on energy geopolitics and North African economic policy. He will be followed by Ingmar Jurgens. Excuse my pronunciation of your surname. He's CEO and co-founder of Climate and Company. Ingmar is an expert in carbon finance, climate policy, anything from modelling, mitigation to adaptation. He's also an expert in climate economics and sustainable finance, and he's worked for OECD, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and for a number of years for the European Commission. And finally, Isabel Buschel. She's the Director for Spain of Transport and Environment. She is a founder and director of the European Federation for Transport and Environment, the Spanish desk. Isabel and her team promote environmental and climate protection in all areas of transport. She holds a PhD from European law from Aix-Marseille University. She combines academic experiences and postdoctoral research funded by the French National Centre for Scientific Research and Swiss Academy for Medical Sciences. And it's an honor and a pleasure to have you here. We hope to have a balanced panel in terms of gender. We tried very hard and it was difficult, so apologies for that. I want to invite all of you, please, to take the stage so we can start our session. And thank you very much for joining us. So, Sebastian, I hope you are online because you are our scene setter. Is Sebastian ready?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sebastian, thank you.
I'm ready.
Hi, we can hear you perfectly well. So thank you ever so much for agreeing to give the first part of the speech. I asked both you and Gonzalo to provide us with an overview, a scene setting, a 10 to 15 minute talk about the European Green Deal, external dimension, internal dimension, and COP. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Sebastian.
And thank you very much for having me remotely. It's very welcome. I hope it will be a positive experience, although I obviously only see the 4 panelists and not the full audience. Let me tell you that I want to bring 3 points to you. I want to talk a little bit about the role of the European Green Deal for the geopolitics of climate change and the geopolitics beyond that, actually. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about COP28 and the role of the EU in climate diplomacy. Obviously, there has already been something said about that by previous speakers. And thirdly, touch upon the next steps for domestic EU climate governance. Let me start with the Green Deal and its geopolitical significance. First of all, the Green Deal, as you know, is both an economic and an environmental and climate strategy. So it's not only about climate and the environment, but it's also about the economy, about reshaping that economy. And that has significance both internally and externally. So that's important, I think, to internalize, to see that is, it's not only economic, it's not only environmental, it's both of that. It's internally, it's externally, both of that. Then a reflection on the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package as the EU's determining the EU's position in geopolitics and in the competition between the major economies. Obviously, there has been a lot of concern about the Inflation Reduction Act of the US, about the approach of China and how the EU can actually somehow compete in that environment. But I think rather than only seeing this always as a problem, let's also reflect on what the Green Deal gives us in this competition. It gives the EU a clear direction. It establishes a very stable, hopefully, at least so far, policy framework that the other partners perhaps don't have. It establishes various funding options also in this. And it's in a rules-based system. And if you look at that and compare that with the US and China, the US, we don't know what will happen after the elections next year. With China, there are obviously other considerations, not necessarily very rule of law oriented. So I don't think the Green Deal actually puts us in a competitive disadvantage, as sometimes nowadays the discussion goes. And thirdly, under that first point, climate geopolitics and talking about geopolitics always is in danger of looking at this as a competition, as a zero-sum game, which it isn't, especially on climate. It's not about what we win, others lose, what others win, we lose. It's about interdependence and structuring that. Obviously, one has a competitive situation there, but we need others to prosper, to be able to also implement and pursue an ambitious climate agenda. And we want others to act. So the Inflation Reduction Act is the US's first real program to address climate change. Let us also be happy about that. that China is the leading manufacturer of solar panels and wind turbines also is the basis for China actually expanding its solar capacity and its wind capacity domestically. Let's welcome that. So I think we need to realize that this is not only zero sum, but that we are in this game together. There's competition, but there's also our interest in them actually prospering and advancing. The second point then, the role of COP28 and the EU in climate diplomacy. There's this new term, the guiding star, right? And the Paris Agreement is the guiding star, but it's important because what we had before obviously was the Kyoto Protocol that was not the guiding star principle that was everybody agrees and in detail what they will do. So the Paris Agreement obviously with its long-term targets, so reducing emissions to zero in the second half of this century, and then later on closer to 2050, etc., but also on adaptation and on financial flows, has this kind of guiding star role where it tries to align actors towards those goals. And I think in that context, COP28 and the global stocktake as the major agenda item there is important as the next step in further specifying that guiding star. So it's not only about climate neutrality around 2050 as soon as possible thereafter globally. It is also about, and others have already talked about it, it's also about expanding renewables now as quickly as possible, enhancing energy efficiency, fossil fuels, but also let's not forget about the other side of the coin, adaptation, finance, means of implementation, and loss and damage. So we shouldn't look at the COPs only as a mitigation event, but also look at the broader agenda. And perhaps in the discussion we can come back to that. And it has already been said, I think the EU's role in the past years, in the past decade, has been one of bridge building, but also one of the driving force of what's called the High Ambition Coalition. And that is still appropriate in the current geopolitical circumstances. And it's probably the best way to shape and sharpen that guiding star notion and trying to get that as concrete as possible. In the aftermath of COP28, perhaps one should already think about it. What is that guiding star, that specification supposed to do? It's supposed to guide parties, countries around the world in the preparation of their next nationally determined contributions due in 2025. Also is supposed to guide them in all kinds of other plans, adaptation plans, etc., that they are going to update and renew. But there's also a whole set of non-state actors, of international cooperative initiatives, of other international organizations out there that need to be mobilized to act and that need to follow up on the COP28 decisions. So I think we need to make a transition in this whole COP circus from just looking at the major decisions to be taken towards what will be the follow-up after that. And I think that will also be important to discuss already at COP28, how that process gets structured, that there is, for example, a reporting back to COP29, what has happened on these targets, rather than agreeing targets, and then we don't know what's happened at the year thereafter. We have had that already. We have agreed to phase down coal. I haven't seen any follow-up on that to see how has it been phased down in the meantime, what have been the steps. So that's important to keep in mind and keep an eye on. And let me then get to the third point that I wanted to make. Next steps for domestic EU climate governance. And why are we talking about domestic when we're focusing on geopolitics, etc.? Because domestic, internal governance and external governance in the climate and environment area are very closely interrelated. What you do at home obviously influences a lot your impact internationally and how you can act internationally. And we all know that the next agenda items in the internal debates are determining the pathway to climate neutrality by 2050. And I should say also, and negative emissions thereafter. We all are focused on climate neutrality, but we also know from all the modeling of the IPCC, etc., that we will have to go to negative emissions thereafter. So that will be the discussion for after my retirement, I'm afraid. And so we'll have a discussion on the 2040 target that will be very important, obviously, for the pathway to 2050, both in terms of environment and how it makes sense economically and for the position of the EU in the world. And we'll have that debate pretty close after COP28, because the provision in the European climate law is also linked to the global stocktake and looking at this after the COP28. Perhaps also what we will have probably in the next mandate of the European Parliament and the next European Commission will be a need to look more at circularity. Teresa Ribera was already talking about circularity, and first attempts, Critical Raw Materials Act, etc., have been made, but there's a lot more ground to cover. We need to get at resource efficiency and circularity. That's crucial for actually achieving the objectives. And let me end with a point about the competitive advantage of the EU, which I said at the beginning is also that we have a rule of law-based system, a rules-based approach, and that we have stability in our regulatory and policy environment. But that stability at this point needs further nurturing, I believe. We know that it's contested, the further steps, how it is done, what should be done. And I think one important response to that should be to foster societal and political ownership and support for the climate transition, which is in question at the moment. And the important things to watch there at the European level, obviously that needs to happen at all levels. But at the European level, there is the upcoming review of the governance regulation, of the regulation on the governance of the Energy Union and climate action that is supposed to happen the first half of 2024, as well as the European climate law that's also supposed to be reviewed. These are the major instruments in which we can think about how to foster further public participation mechanisms and how we can anchor better the climate transition and the discussion about the climate transition in our societies in Europe. But it's also important to understand, and I want to stress that is actually also playing into the competitive advantage that the EU has and should keep of developing the economy and the climate transition and the climate objectives in tandem. Thanks very much. I leave it at that. I think 12 minutes or so. Hope that's okay. Thanks very much.
Fantastic.
Looking forward to the debate.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Yes, that was on time. Was not expecting anything less. So now over to you, Gonzalo, and please, if you can run us through the key issues and where the EU can be in the governance and geopolitics of the energy transition, and perhaps focusing also on the Mediterranean, the southern neighborhood, and Latin America and the Caribbean, which I don't know whether you're aware, but it's very difficult to get it on the agenda in the European Union. We insist time and time again, and we work on it. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara, and please let me reiterate how thankful we are to BC3 and IEP. Thank you so much for proposing us to cooperate with you. We are really glad that we got such a great representation from Spain in your network. You are with very, very serious people, doing real serious scientific research, and we are very glad to be represented in the network by BC3. I think these kind of meetings are very important. It has been said by our minister, also by Valvanera, it's important to try to get a new script, a new narrative. It's important to communicate, and it's important to bridge between academia and society. And I think that think tanks are quite well prepared for this, to try to do this job, for putting things together and keeping the conversation closer. And I think these kind of events are really, really worthy, and I want to thank you all for making this possible. Sorry for this introduction, but I wanted to say so. Lara asked me to say something about the European Union and net zero geopolitics. I'm also a 3 points professor, so I will make also 3 points on this. First, I think that, we tend to think, and I really tend to think, that the energy transition is good for geopolitics. It leads to more cooperative geopolitical ambience and context. But we cannot be so naive to think that all things that will, of course, together. So there are for sure things to monitor in the energy transition from a geopolitical perspective. I mean, it has been mentioned, the critical minerals, all the things, exporting without measure, and in my opinion, renewable resources from the global south to the north, to me, is a bit, something to be discussed. The second thing is what's the impact of this on European Union external action? How can we proceed on this? And then I will try to focus and try to, land these very abstract ideas in the cases of the Mediterranean and Latin America. So, sure, net zero transition has geopolitical consequences. But also geopolitics influence the energy transition and renewable deployment. So it's this two-directional, somehow ambiguous relation needs a careful analysis. It has been mentioned. It's not a question of zero-sum games. I fully agree on that. But anyway, within the energy transition, we will get winners and losers. I mean, there will be countries that have been exporting lots of oil and gas that will have to change, and not all of them will be able to convert into renewable exporters. So there will be losers, and there will be winners also. And this will alter and shift geopolitical balances. So some of them could be positive. For instance, if we get more good for geopolitics. I mean, if we got more renewables at home, we will get more strategic autonomy. So that's a good thing. If we got a lot of countries getting significant losses in the transition that we cannot compensate, that will be a risk. And also we got new vulnerabilities arising. So, and we have to manage them. Also, this is something that usually is not very well understood, geopolitics has very serious consequences on net zero. The current spat or the current rivalry between the US and China is probably harming development deployment in the US itself, harming probably more the US and transition to net zero. If we proceed in this, well, we have good news in the last days, so that's good to try not to be too much protectionist and not to fragment too much value change and lose competitiveness and then lose this opportunity narrative. So we have to be aware of this. That could be a negative impact. On the other side, for Europe, this Russian energy crisis has been really a driver for going and to accelerate the energy transition. So it's quite ambiguous. It depends on, and it's not linear, because it depends on where the mood or the social mood are. So this relation is complex. It's not that easy than saying, yeah, we are going for a better world. If we don't do nothing, not necessarily so. So that's first one. Which EU script, in my opinion, should we try to project abroad for a European Union external action? It has been mentioned, we got CBAM now. This risks further fragmenting
value chains. I mean, I will enter later on the Mediterranean and Latin American perspectives. But it is also true that it gives the opportunity to change the independence pattern of our energy system. If we get a CBAM, then we have to forget about importing renewable resources as such. What we should do is to integrate renewable resources in the whole value chain. And I will give more details later on. This is what we have been calling at Elcano a green co-shoring. That's it. It's not about friend-shoring only. It's not about allies in political terms. It's not about countries being close to. It's sharing green values also, and regulations, and showing a commitment to converge on this. This kind of initiative should be inclusive. I'm not saying going to those countries to export green hydrogen to, sorry guys, Germany. It's not what I'm saying. It's going to those countries to help them to decarbonize and to exert the soft green power of a viable, sustainable, and responsible for human security energy system. I think that's the role and the narrative, the script the European Union should be pushing. How can we implement this, or how can we illustrate this in the Mediterranean and Latin America? I'm going to try to go very fast on that. The Mediterranean. Let me put an example like Morocco. Industrial integration between the European Union and Morocco, Spain and Morocco, is huge. Intra-industry, trade dominates, and intra-firms, among the same firms, dominate intra-industry. So the degree of industrial integration is huge. It's huge. What we should be working now is how can we certify those manufacturing exports from Morocco in order not to pay for CBAM. We need to look ways to sign free trade areas where those countries in the Mediterranean are not subject to local content requirements in Net Zero Industry Act, and so on and so forth. For Morocco, is it worthy that Morocco export green electricity or green hydrogen? A country that, despite his efforts, is today, electricity mix is 65% coal. Exporting this, or it is worthy to help this country to decarbonize. His industrial consumption, they are huge phosphate exporters. Use your renewable energy and your green hydrogen to produce green fertilizer that won't be subject to CBAM. And later on, amplify this to the whole manufacturing sector, industry, in the automotive sector, and so on and so forth. Latin America is different because in the Mediterranean, renewable deployment is very limited. Besides Morocco, very little effort has been made. Only Morocco and Israel are planning to have a carbon pricing system. So in Latin America, it's much more heterogeneous. So you got opportunities with several countries like Chile, Brazil, and you got more room for mutual learning. We in Europe are studying nodal electricity system regulation from Chile to implement here. So we have been having a very serious dialogue on climate laws in both sides of the Atlantic. So there are more space for mutual learning, and there is also more space for industrial integration. I'm going to close with the same idea than with Morocco. Does it make sense for Chile or for Brazil to export green hydrogen to the European Union, or is it better those countries to invest those renewable resources in producing green lithium, green copper, green iron pellets by Brazil to be exported to the European Union? This kind of decarbonized integration, inclusive one, is what I think should inform the narrative of European Union external action. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. You've been... Thank you. So the European Union basically is a companion to the transition to our partners, rather than going there, extracting resources and being seen also as an opportunistic and colonizer, really, a green colonizer. So, yeah, that is, I think, a powerful message to resend again. Ingmar, the floor is yours, and I know you're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the latest updates in the European Union. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, listen, I changed everything after
Oh,
listening.
great.
But thanks so much for these two inspiring interventions. And hi everybody. So my name is Ingmar. Yeah, I'm the CEO of one of Europe's leading sustainable finance think tanks. I started working in climate change in 1998, and that's hence this long list that you had of all kinds of things I'm an expert in. That's obviously not true, but I just meant I try to combine different perspectives and build bridges. That's what we do, and I try to do that now. I mean, yeah, the good old three messages, right? So we need functioning global institutions. The institutions are broken, and we need to be pragmatic and make it work. That's the three things I have to say to you today. Now, in terms of functioning global institutions, well, one could just assume it or just ask, why do we actually need them? Why are they so important? And I'm going to touch again on Sebastian's and on Gonzalo's points here. Because of frictions, because of scale and efficiency, and because of value chains. That's why we need global institutions. We need it because there's loads of frictions on the one hand, because there's winners and losers. Well, within countries and obviously between countries. But we're also causing frictions with our international legislation, like supply chain legislation, and I'm going to get back to that very important point later. Then there's scale and efficiency. I mean, there's many, well, there's actually four economists on the, we're a bit biased here, aren't we? 4 economists on the panel?
Lawyer.
A lawyer, okay, lovely, okay, brilliant. So, well, we need scale and efficiency, right? It's such a massive effort we have ahead of us. Such a massive amount of investment that needs to be scaled. We cannot afford fragmentation. We can really not afford it. Everybody's talking about reshoring, right? I mean, are we going to produce everything now again in every country? I mean, then we can also go back living, you know, in little, you know, in the mountains or in wooden huts if we want to. But if we want to, we are serious about all these investments and the innovations we need. We need comparative advantage. We need competition and cooperation. Yeah? And unfortunately, the international organizations that are supposed to promote this are pretty broke. So I'm going to get back to how we can nevertheless maybe move forward on this type of cooperation. And then the third thing, we have trade is largely about global supply chains. A very large share happens within global supply chains today. And if you look at value chains from a climate change perspective, it's also the combination of consumption and production. Yeah? So we are very smart in Europe, right? We decided to do production-based accounting of carbon emissions, right? And so we reduced emissions, right? No, well, not really, right? We just shifted the energy-intensive stuff abroad. So we can point the finger at China and say, you're the bad guys. You have all the emissions. We're still consuming those emissions, by the way. Yeah? So it just shows us, it's the same for deforestation. Actually, land use wasn't mentioned, I think, a single time today. 30% of global emissions are there. It's the #1 killer of biodiversity. And we have very integrated international supply chains in the food sector, for example. But 80% of natural capital destruction, 80% of natural capital destruction associated with EU economic activity happens outside the EU. And so, yeah, institutions are broken. I'm not going to get into that. There's G20 is, you know, has been basically eroded. WTO is not really working. Now, how can we move forward pragmatically? So we have these. I think, this strong need of making it work, and that's maybe my most important message. We have put a lot on the table. Yeah? Various successes also under the Spanish presidency have been put on the table today, have been mentioned today, and now we need to make it work. I mean, the one thing here, obviously for people, but also making it work for our partners. We are the geopolitical panel here, right? So we need to make these things work. And we need to do that, I think. We can do UN negotiations, lovely. I love them. I'm a former UN guy. I've been, COP9 was my first COP. And that's probably important for that kind of the baseline, the least common denominator. But the least common denominator, as in the UN, is not going to get us there. What we need now is building trust in a plurilateral manner with some key sectors and some key countries. Who are the steel producers? 15 sectors of 250 sectors represent 90% of the emissions. In each of these sectors, you have 5, 6, 7 relevant countries that are producing. Why can we not try to move forward in a very pragmatic way, focusing on, say, the food sector and land use, focusing on the CBAM sectors, and then try to make it work? We need lighthouses, and if we are supporting, and I think we need to use development cooperation and finance to support now our partner countries in implementing CBAM and in implementing the EU deforestation regulation. I mean, we should have done that 5 years ago when we actually started discussing these dossiers. Yeah? We are behind the curve, but we still need to do it. And I think that'll be really, really crucial. And then maybe we can build lighthouses of international cooperation. It's very difficult to build lighthouses of international corporations with 180 plus countries. Sometimes it happens. In Paris it happened. But maybe we can dare to be pragmatic and build these lighthouses and build trust again in international cooperation. And I think that'll be very important. And so a couple of examples I wanted to share with you before I conclude. I won't get into the Mercosur deal too much, but I mean, that will be a very interesting conversation to have. I mean, I think a lot of the technical stuff, if we get to a deal, will happen later, will happen in 24. So there's a lot of scope for working that out. But it's so related. Why did nobody see the link between the EU deforestation regulation and the Mercosur agreement? Yeah, I mean, we're basically basically making it very difficult to access the world's biggest market, namely the EU, with your agricultural products because you have to comply with our deforestation rules. But we haven't thought about how we are helping small holders in Brazil to comply. The result will be leakage. The result will be, well, if it's difficult to comply and if it's really too difficult to export to Europe, we are not going to export to Europe. Yeah? So for making Mercosur work, we need to build some trust on the Brazilian side that we can help them make it work. Otherwise, we see what's happening. There's a lot of pressure on environmental dilution at the moment. And so, so making it work globally, I think this one of the key files I want to get to now is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And I mean, what do I like so much about the deforestation regulation and the due diligence directive? It is that finally Europe is taking seriously its footprint in the world. Yeah, we're finally doing this. We're saying, no, you have to exercise due diligence of what is happening upstream. Those 80% that are hidden in the supply chain. I think that's great. Applause for Europe to finally be the first region in the world that is doing that. It's starting to acknowledge that we're causing a lot of havoc in terms of human rights violations and environmental destructions abroad. And so that is super important. But what just happened yesterday, under the Spanish presidency, I mean, yeah, I'm depressed. That's why I'm so cheerful. I'm depressed because what was decided yesterday in the Council was to exclude financial institutions from the scope of the due diligence directive. So, if I may be provocative, the Spanish government is giving a free ride to the financial sector. That was a bit surprising from this government to see. And I know it's a lot of pressure by the French and so on, but it is so utterly important. We have currently no incentives for the financial sectors to discontinue financing all of that stuff. There's billions and billions flowing into environmental destructions and human rights violations by EU financial institutions. And the entire financial framework has nothing in place that really truly incentivizes them. It was on the table until yesterday. So if I can, I'll just ask everybody here to call up whoever you know who is still part of these negotiations and tell them to to change that. We need financial institutions in this game. We need a level playing field again. It's important. We need to speak with one voice. We need to be the ones that are setting benchmarks. If I talk from a Eurocentric perspective, I'd rather want the Europeans to be the first at setting a due diligence benchmark for financial institutions. Or do we want to follow then the US standard? Or do we want to follow the Chinese standard? I think it should be us who are shaping this. And so this is an example where I hope I've explained well why this global governance is also much about us taking responsibility about what is happening, what we are causing outside. It is about reaching out a hand to our partners and supporting them. But then we need to walk the walk in Europe as well. And that means we need to adopt really more rigorous regulation than what was just decided yesterday. And it's still open for discussion, so let's maybe change that. The very last word I had for you, I'm sorry, I'm not at my best, I'm a bit sick, so I'm just realizing that I'm maybe talking too much. I'm sorry for that. So I hope I got that message across. It's the last thing, again, taking one step back and the role of science here that we're discussing a bit, right? I mean, this is the whole Think 2030 idea is about that. And I think we need to, it's also a point that Gonzalo made before, I'm sorry, maybe it was Sebastian, right? Fostering societal support. Yeah, that's exactly what we need. We need to relate all the fancy stuff we're doing at university and in our think tanks, all this also technocratic stuff we're sometimes writing down that nobody understands. We need to relate that to what people care about. People like the EU. People like Europe because it gives them prosperity, security, and a voice in the world. That's what surveys still tell us. So we all should go into these EU elections as scientists and researchers to relate to what people care about. And to show how the Green Deal and transition, and it was explained before, and how far that is part of this prosperity. Yeah? Sebastian said that before, and how far it's part of also having a voice in the world by setting standards. We need to explain it better. Maybe we could just stop research. How about we just all stop researching for the next... I think we have done all the research we need. I don't think we need more. We just need to explain it better. Yeah, and I think that would be extremely good. But then we need to help partners and I think also show in Europe what others are doing. I find that so important because everybody tells us all the time when we want to do environmentally ambitious stuff in Europe that we are gold plating and nobody else is doing anything. That's bullshit. There's so much happening in China today. I know it's so popular to do China bashing. There's so much going on in China today. There's so much going on in Brazil now with that new civilized government that we have there, with this amazing environmental minister we have there. There's so much going on. I could tell you 20 examples where countries like Brazil or also China are more advanced than Europe. And I think that message is important. So people don't feel left alone and think that Europe has to handle the whole burden of the transformation. Yeah, and ultimately, at the end of the day, as I said, we need to just make it work. We need to now, basically do this and then work with, it's terrible, okay, I'll leave that. But we have to work now with SMEs, for example, those that are struggling most. We have to work with people and with our partners. And then at the end of the day, maybe at the end of the day being end of 24, early 25, when the new commission is, for example, coming in, we have shown that it's working. Yeah? And we don't need to show that for 250 sectors. We can maybe show it for 4 sectors. We can maybe show it for 10 companies in Spain, 20 in Germany, 15 in France. That's okay. Yeah, but we need to show that it works. And I think then we can, then I think we are in a good position to mobilize this potential of global cooperation that we need. Thanks.
Thank you, Ingmar. That was tremendously provocative. I know we start to be, it's a long session, so having someone with a strong argument is always good. I have to disagree with you on one thing and agree with you on 3 others. So I do not think that we should stop science. Please never stop science. I have to disagree on this one.
Pause. Pause.
Yeah, pause. Yeah, no, we have to disagree on that one. On institutions supporting partners, including financial institutions, I absolutely have to agree. I know that on focusing and not expanding and being judicious, Isabel is going to agree, and I think I can give you now the floor. I don't know whether you're going to change everything that you were going to say after all of this, but hopefully you will be able to talk about the Net Zero Industry Act and perhaps a bit about the transport sector in particular. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lara. It'll be a pleasure. Hello, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for counting with Transport and Environment on this panel. We're the European Federation of Ecological Associations working on sustainable mobility and transport. And in that sense, it is, from our view, interesting to see or to agree that, yes, international institutions are broken, but from our experience, we're Brussels-based, EU institutions still keep working. And in the sense that we have effective compliance mechanisms. So from our perspective, we need to get the most climate ambitious laws and to ensure their effective implementation. So responding to the question asked to the panel, what's the EU's role in governing geopolitics of net zero transition? From our point of view, the EU's role is to promote clean tech production and demand in order to maintain climate leadership in Europe, to avoid losing competitiveness, it was mentioned by all of you, to strengthen EU's energy security and strategic autonomy. So, as a stock take, let's say, strong climate policies have proven to be effective. They are much needed, but also we're now at a time where we see they're not enough. So, what is additionally needed is a successful green industrial policy for Europe, characterized by a limited technological scope, indeed not 20 sectors, 4 maybe the strategic ones, extra EU funding and an efficient use of it, that must be monitored, green simplification, and circularity and demand reduction. I will go a bit deeper in a few minutes. I promise to not be too long. So, I'm going to talk about the Net Zero Industrial Act. What are the 5 ingredients of a successful green industrial policy? First of all, we have, as mentioned, strong climate policies, the Green Deal. If we take it as a concrete example in transport, the car CO2 regulation that was adopted last year. These are examples. They're the best cost-effective tool to bring green investment. Second, we need strong environmental regulations, Water Framework Directive, Habitats, REACH. A few weeks ago, I visited the Rio Tinto mining site in Andalusia. When you see some wastewater there, you realize how important it is to ensure the effective implementation of the laws we already have in place. So they should not be watered down as we speed up manufacturing. Third, we need fiscal support. What do I mean by that? We need a strong EU IRA response, meaning we need a response, financially speaking, that is not toothless. That could also be done through temporary state aid, and there have been some adjustments, in order to target the green sustainable value chain and ensure an EU level playing field. I've mentioned before as a 4th point the green simplification. What do we mean by this? We mean that it is important to eliminate administrative bottlenecks in the transition. We need authorities to dispose of sufficient staff to deal with all the files, with all the impact assessments. So we need this to happen in transparency, but what we need is that there are no hurdles on an administrative plan. And finally, circularity and demand reduction should be the core parts of EU industrial strategy. The Vice President has mentioned before the importance of reduce, reuse, recycle. So that's actually the way to reduce the tremendous and increasing transport emissions. We need more efficient mobility, more efficient transport of goods. And this transition can be for Europe an industrial opportunity. So the Net Zero Industrial Act, it's a good start, but it still needs to be improved. So the Council has not stated yet its position, so there's still some wiggle room. It should mirror the US IRA in focus, we think. It's exemplar in this sense. Also in simplicity and visibility. So as to the scope, there has been a list proposed on technological sectors. We think this is a wish list. This is not a strategic plan. A strategic plan, you need to choose what you need to give priority. You cannot try to please everyone. You need to reflect a vision. So we think the technological scope must be reduced to future-proof sectors like battery cells, cell components and critical metals, processing for batteries. Renewable energy sources, of course, and technologies like wind power, heat pumps. Green hydrogen and e-fuel production, but carefully, e-fuel use, please, not in sectors that are already, where there are already existing zero-emission technologies. So let's keep the e-fuels to aviation and shipping, which are the hard-to-decarbonize sectors. And finally, last but not least, grids for charging infrastructure. These must be the absolute indispensable strategic technological sectors. Let's keep the focus. We must make sure to exclude fossil fuels, unproven or environmentally harmful technologies. I'm referring to biofuels, biogas, non-renewable hydrogen, and only support technologies that are in line with our EU climate objectives, with the circular economy and zero pollution goals. Then there is the Made in Europe requirement for access to markets for production. As mentioned, our task is, our duty is to foster clean tech demand in Europe for the before-mentioned reasons. How? By integrating non-price criteria, for instance, in public procurements, renewable auctions, and support schemes for consumers. We need to reinforce the weight of sustainability and resilience criteria, both in access to markets and in incentives. Now, if we have that plan set, how do we finance it? Of course, important investments are needed to back the Net Zero Industrial Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act. Without any joint EU funding, there is the risk of a fragmentation of the single market. So there is a toolbox now that we have of financial instruments. There is the STEP platform, the Strategic Technologies for Europe platform. It is aimed to supporting the strategic clean technology projects with grants, with loans, guarantees, and equity. What is needed now at this stage of the process? We need more resources in STEP. Under the MFF, the Multi-Annual Financial Framework Review, we need to pull together all the financial tools that are available. So this is not a completely new instrument. It is a platform that seeks to mobilize available funding within the scope of existing instruments and to deploy them in a more focused manner. So that includes efficient use of recovery money, ETS national revenues, and it also implies to channel state aid support to, in our view, to refining, processing, and recycling projects. The STEP platform just mentioned, it is about to be adopted. It is the funding right now foreseen, which could reach up to 160 billion euros. In our view, it is too little. But it's not too late. And here our message to governments is that we need to inject more than the currently debated additional 10 billion euros in STEP. We need to make it truly supportive of the objectives of the Net Zero Industrial Act, of the Critical Raw Materials Act. And it needs to focus on scaling up clean tech production for innovative companies, both including OPEX and CAPEX. Which are the two existing funding tools that need to be reinforced? These are the Innovation Fund and the one is an existing tool, it's the Innovation Fund. It needs to be expanded to focus on the midstream value chain of batteries, the refining and process stage. And there is a new instrument that's under InvestEU that needs to be created to contain guarantees and counter-guarantees for loans to strategic projects under these both instruments. And that's the main messages, and happy to engage in the debate.
Thank you. So that was a very rich debate. I would like to perhaps ask all of you to reflect, and this will hopefully lead well into the second session on just transition, because we have at the international level, we know we have a framework for just transition. We have the Celestial Declaration, we have instruments within the European Union, we have a just transition strategy in Spain, but from the international arena, we have the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. And I'm going to first ask Sebastian to comment perhaps briefly on expected outcomes of the COP in a bit more detail, and then comment on how the Just Transition Energy Partnerships are panning out, and perhaps reflect on whether more in the Mediterranean or in Latin America and the Caribbean, because we know that under the Global Gateway we have the South African, Just Transition Energy Partnerships, but we see nothing of the sort in Latin America. So I would like to ask you how that social dimension that's been pointed out by all of you, that appropriation, that hand that we have to shake with our partners, can be strengthened through this sort of mechanisms, or a different type of institution, perhaps, if these are having problems. So Sebastian, over to you with COP and then Just Energy Transition Partnerships, and we will have a round of questions and answers with the audience as well. So if you want to sort of think about your questions, there will be mics going around after this first round. Sebastian, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for all the other interventions, very interesting debates. Yeah, as I mentioned already, the major agenda item obviously is the global stocktake that needs to come to a conclusion at this COP. It has been underway for 2 years, as you know, with technical assessment phase, etc.
Sorry, Sebastian.
Yeah.
Can I ask you whether you expect, a decision, a political declaration, an annex, where all of the inputs that have been put forward will be accessed by countries from a platform in order to inform their NDCs, whether you can, I know I'm asking you to look at the crystal ball here, but if you can, thank you.
Yeah, perhaps as a background, in the discussion over these 2 years was also as an outcome of this process, whether we would have a GST decision, whether we might have something that would be declaration, which is something that not all the parties would need to sign up to, right? And or whether there would be an annex to the decision that would contain further technical detail available to parties, especially also for specific sectors, what kind of options are out there and what actions could be taken. As far as I see the discussion evolving, there seems to be increasing agreement that there should be a GST decision. This is what COPs usually do, right? They come up with a decision that would address the GST and summarize both backward-looking elements, so kind of assessing how far we have gotten and what still needs to be done, as well as forward-looking elements, what should then happen next, or what could the focus be. And always keep in mind, right, this is not only about mitigation. I know that in Europe and in another part of the hemisphere, it's usually, yes, we only look at mitigation, but it's also about adaptation, about means of implementation, finance, loss and damage, etc. So there's likely to be a GST decision. There's unlikely to be an annex. I think that kind of idea perhaps was buried. We had the technical synthesis report of the technical phase of the dialogue of the GST. And that didn't really come up with a proposal for such an annex and how it could look like. So negotiating that seems virtually impossible in the environment in which we operate. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't be means available. You mentioned the platform online, all the materials are out there. Other actors have put forward kind of templates for these pathways and roadmaps to action in particular sectors. So that is available, but probably not part of the official outcome of COP28. And the declaration, I guess there's still a possibility that may arise, but it seems to be tricky then to distinguish what could be in the declaration, what could be in the decision. So I think parties are currently working towards a decision rather than a declaration. So yeah, and that would be, it was mentioned, the main items on mitigation would be a renewable energy kind of target going towards 2030, doubling the energy efficiency improvement rates across the world towards 2030, fossil fuel phase out, yeah, perhaps not with 2030 as the deadline. But important is then, as I said, this is at a very high level of aggregation. If you look at it, renewables is relevant for many sectors. Energy efficiency is relevant for many sectors. And as I said before, I think we should go away from the perception that the COP would be the one thing, and then at the end say, wow, great, we have renewables mentioned and the tripling. Let's lean back, this is done. No, what does it mean? It will need to be translated. Ideally, these kind of signals that the process sends would be even more concrete and would talk about, let's say, achieving 2/3 of renewables in the electricity sector. Then at least the power sector knows what to do. But it will likely be more at an even more aggregate level. So there needs to be a process afterwards where this is boiled down, brought to the sectors, brought to all these initiatives that exist internationally on renewables, on energy efficiency in general, where this is kind of presented as the guiding star and used to align the activities towards those targets. I think that's the kind of theory of change behind it. And the same for adaptation, where we have much more difficulty actually establishing this kind of guiding star. So that would be a major progress if we could have a couple of targets, indicators that would guide us in our adaptation policies that become more important by the day, as we know. And yeah, finance, perhaps the loss and damage fund obviously seems to be more or less agreed, but I'm sure there will be at the COP further discussion about that. But then there's also the discussion about the next form of the quantified financial goal. And also there's some progress hopefully can be expected. Article 6, I leave to others. The jet piece, perhaps, a funny animal, seems to be a very productive approach of getting to a more concrete level with advanced economies, facing two issues. One is actual implementation afterwards that we see in South Africa, right? There is a JETP, but the country faces enormous barriers and troubles of actually getting it into action. And the second is, how far should we go with that, and what would be the instruments? Because at the moment, these are offers to, let's say, emerging economies, right? Let's be frank. What about the many other countries that are out there that also want to transition? And that comes to the question, how many more of these JETPs may we have? It's a matter of finance, it's a matter of negotiating, but it's perhaps also a matter of thinking about this also in equity terms. How do we create an offer also for other countries that are not Brazil, that are not India, that are not Indonesia, that are etc. Can we devise an instrument that's kind of aggregating perhaps a number of countries in a region or so to come up with similar arrangements? But it's promising, but still needs to be implemented. That would be successfully implemented. That would be my take on it. Perhaps I'll leave it there. I have also talked for long enough for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Gonzalo, if you want to comment on the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, that's great. Perhaps also, because we've discussed it a lot in the Institute, the extent to which we could use like the, institutions such as the Ibero-American Network of Climate Change Officers, expand that to, Mediterranean countries, that technical level institution that we can then support at a more political level, and whether, you think there are other things that we can do for another issue that we've been working on as well, which is the acceptance of climate policies. What are the levers for society to accept those climate policies?
Wow, that's a lot of questions. I will try to be very brief on the first one, on just transition in Latin America. I can talk a lot about this issue because I just read your wonderful paper you just have written, and it will be published in a few days. So then we will have to explain it, as has been properly said in my opinion. Trying to be very brief. I don't want to get into, I will be accused of plagiarism, and I don't want to do that. But one of the things that at the Institute we have done in the past, is trying to find to what extent the just transition contracts here in Spain and Europe could be, let's say, replicated or be in a kind of model to be adopted by other countries. And then the trade unions, they told us that, well, in Latin America, not to say in the Mediterranean, the trade union environment is much different than what we have here. In Latin America, please let me not to use any term to qualify them. In the Mediterranean, in several places, they are just, government prolongation. So, it's very difficult to get that institutional setting, On the Global Gateway that you mentioned before, the research we have conducted with our team at the Institute, with Ignacio Urbazos and others, in Latin America, we have found a very fragmented approach. When we talk to Spanish companies that are involved in some Global Gateway projects in Latin America, they don't know much about them. They are not that very much,
is not having traction in order to change the situation, you know? If we go to the Mediterranean, in the last call, I think only 3 projects were chosen in the Mediterranean. One was a cable, the Medusa cable. I think none of them have to do with energy, if I remember it well. I just wrote that a few days ago, but I don't remember. 3 projects, Global Gateway, in the Mediterranean? Are we kidding? Is this the priority we are giving to a region that in the last month is literally in flames? And this geopolitically in the Mediterranean really worries us at the Institute, because we are seeing in the Mediterranean a real disconnection of the people in the south with Europe because of the Gaza conflict and the European approach. So, geopolitically, the Mediterranean is getting more and more fragmented. And European narratives are getting more and more difficult to pass. So, I mean, I'm a bit skeptical about the infra-specification of the Global Gateway projects and the lack of traction for the private sector in the region. The other thing is the institutional, I mean, we got this Ibero-American network of climate office. The idea is let's try to do some cooperation, technical cooperation on things, and well, you will explain that much better than I do. But what is interesting to me is this can be used as a device for both diffusion, cooperation, and convergence. It has been useful. If I will be the Spanish Ministry of Cooperation, I will give a lot of money in donation, in aid, to those institutions in Latin America, and to set them up in the Mediterranean, because in many Mediterranean countries, those climate change offices are really, really very understaffed. They don't got any autonomy. They are completely subordinated to the oil and gas ministry or a national company or whatever. So again, I think that's a way to work it, but this has to be done with European support and, you know, not trying to impose it, and being aware that we are undergoing geopolitically a very difficult war. I mean, just to remember, the NATO strategic concept is pervasive instability and recurrent shocks. That's the geopolitical context in which we are, and that's make very, very difficult institutionalization efforts. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Ingmar, over to you. I don't know whether you want to comment on you know, the international dimension of just energy transition partnerships. If not, I do have a question. So, in your opinion, which is currently the most important decision to be taken by the EU in terms of supply chain or trade-relevant regulatory measures? We've talked about a few, but I don't know whether you want to delve on this a bit more.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think JEFPs are in principle a good idea. I think climate clubs are another idea if we can relate them explicitly to CBAM sectors and to deforestation, so those areas where we have regulation on the table.
So you specifically talk about transformational climate clubs in Robert Faulkner's parlance, so not only you know, ideational and or bargaining climate clubs like the G7 or G20.
No, I mean tangible policy implementation on key sectors. It's again, I guess I'm hammering my message here, right? I mean, this is like focusing on those sectors, and then again, diplomatically speaking, from a soft diplomacy, I think Gonzalo was talking about earlier, point of view. Yeah, let's use these clubs to make things like CBAM work, to make things like the EU deforestation regulation work for the partners. I think that would be a very pragmatic approach. But I mean, we have these international standard setting bodies and all that, and we have, that's all fine. But we need to work very concretely with few countries, upstream and downstream, in these trade relationships. Within the G20, it could be G20 countries, but not the G20, to make it work, to find the solutions and to agree on common implementation of these policies. But they will be differentiated because they have a different role in the supply chain and the structure of the economy and the world trade system. So there will be, but they're different parts of the same story. And I think that will be super crucial. That's what I would focus the support on, also on these kind of sectoral approaches, so to say. Then I think in terms of empowerment, what is in it for Lula's people, so to say? Yeah, I mean, that is an answer that Lula has to add. He has to give an answer to that question. What is in it for my electorate? What is in it for my constituency? And so this is, again, he needs to show that this thing works for them. So one idea that I think is interesting, so we can continue considering emerging economies and developing countries as providers of cheap raw materials. We like that, right? That's our neo-colonialist attitude to world trade. I can see the advantages of that. But I mean, there's a new commodity now. Again, welcome in the year 2023. I mean, in the digital age. I mean, a very important commodity is information and data. So we have actually just generated massive demand for data with our disclosure regulation, right? Increasingly, financial institutions and big corporates have to disclose along their value chain their environmental and human rights violations. So let's make it simple, like carbon emissions. And somebody has to provide that data. And when we built the carbon market 20 years ago, with a clean development mechanism, all these high value added activities, they went to Ecosecurities, to Winrock. They went to UK, Europe, US-based companies. None of the high value-added activities remained in Latin America, to use that example. But can we make that different? Can people, and I mean people on the ground who are the best in understanding environmental impacts of specific economic activities on the ground, can they be the ones, can they become part of the data value chain? And hence be actually having access to high value-added activities. So that's a very specific example of how, with all these new regulation that we have on the table, how our partners, and I mean then partners, it's not something abstract, it's not countries, I mean specific actors that may have most to lose, we can make them actually winners and not losers of the transformation. So I think that's it, and at the end of the day then it's, I guess, market access. We have to facilitate market access. I mean, it's totally legitimate and absolutely necessary in the domestic discourse to appreciate the importance of competitiveness concerns of our industry. We won't get anywhere in the next years if we don't take that seriously, right? That's the number one, that's the Bible, from now on. Again, right, as it was 20 years ago when we did the carbon leakage provisions. And so that's where we're coming from, and that's why we're doing CBAM, and that's maybe also why we're doing the EUDR, the deforestation regulation, to create a level playing field also for our farmers, for those people in rural areas that are currently voting for right-wing parties that are putting in question the pillars of our democratic systems. So, I mean, we need to, in all fairness, show there's something in it for them. I think we're doing that. We're not explaining that well. Nobody has explained that the deforestation regulation is leveling the playing field for our farmers. Yeah, let's go out there and explain them that we are their friend. Brussels is their friend. We're working for them. And now, on the other hand, if this leads to lack of market access, to reduction of market access for our partners in the Mediterranean, in Latin America, I don't care what. That is impossible. So we need to, at the same point, help them to guarantee this market access. I mean, one very specific, just to be a bit more specific now, not all bloomy and fluffy. CBM, the CBAM thing. So it is all about equivalency, right? And I mean, in all fairness, Brazil won't have a problem. I think Brazil will be just equivalent. I don't think they're going to have a problem. But most countries will have a tremendous...
Because of their carbon market that's discussed right now? Or?
Because I think they're going to solve it. I mean, that's just my belief. I mean, we work a lot, and we have been working for many, many years in Brazil. I think it's just an example that it's not like it's impossible for everybody. I don't know. I don't think so. But it's quite impossible for most. So we are having this big debate, if we can link again, build a bridge here. We're having this conversation about transition finance. Yeah, we had a discussion about finance and the taxonomy, and so working for the green niche only. So we all agree that sustainable finance is about financing the transition from dirty to clean, from cement and steel, not financing renewables. Yeah, the bulk is the transformation that still needs to happen. And now the whole discussion is about what is a credible transformation? When can a company actually show that it qualifies for green finance because it has actually embarked on a very credible transition plan? I think that is the most interesting part of the climate conversation now. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't want to discredit the conversations about renewables and so on. That's obviously critical, but this is less painful. It's more painful in these other areas. And if we're talking about equivalency, for example, in the context of CBAM, cannot countries be treated as equivalent that have actually embarked on a very credible transition? And we have to define that well. But if we are putting the mark here and saying, as long as you're not here, jump, as long as you don't get that hurdle, we don't consider you equivalent, who's going to swallow that policy? I don't think that's going to work. And the last bit on the CBAM, maybe, from the conversations, we also colleagues of ours, like Balfour Sang of E3G, for example, he had this nice presentation in New York. I shared yesterday already with some people, where he said, okay, there's the political discourse where everybody says CBAM sucks, neo-colonialism, and we don't want it. And pragmatically, at the market level, companies are trying to figure it out. That is also what's happening in China, because they don't want to be cut out of the biggest market in the world, which is still the EU. Yeah? But that's so obvious that now we have to, again, make that easier, help them with their reporting requirements, make it easy. Those are the very tangible things that could happen in these climate clubs, or that could be financed and supported by these sort of JETPs. I don't like the focus on energy because I think land use is equivalently important, but never mind, they're the same concept. And I think it has to be so concrete. Otherwise, they probably turn out to be either talk shops, or we're gonna really don't know what is happening in terms of implementation, as was mentioned before. Yeah, so I think that's probably the level we have to get to, and then focus on these things and make that work. Yeah.
Thank you. We agree a bit more on some of this. Perhaps I see experts in the room, saying no with their heads to whether Brazil's going to. But we can discuss that with the audience. So, Isabel, I wanted to prod you a little bit on the green simplification. I know we have been hearing calls for, halting the regulatory inflation. Sebastian talks about the thickening of regulation in the European Union. There are concerns out there in the environmental community about whether we are going to be able to, ensure that environmental integrity is, observed everywhere, given that institutions are strained for people in order to provide permits, to accelerate those permits. So I wanted you to comment perhaps a little bit on this, and if you want to also comment on perhaps more infrastructure-related issues with transport. In the National Energy and Climate Plan in Spain, we have very ambitious goals. And if you want to touch upon, just energy transition partnerships in general, so that we can then hand over to the second table, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. It's all linked. So, referring to green tape, just to be clear, it is very important that we have transparent guarantees in place to protect environmental safeguards, social standards. That's what we have been promoting within all the Critical Raw Materials Act process. So we don't want at any cost for environmental and social safeguards to be eliminated. They are much needed. What we think is there needs to take place this translation that Sebastian also referred to. In this translation process from the directive, from the regulation, when it comes down to the member states, we need to make things more agile. We need to accelerate the transition. And so referring to, you pointed out the charging infrastructure, for example. So in many member states, including Spain, what has been identified as a bottleneck in the speed of rolling out e-charging infrastructure across the whole country are administrative hurdles. So there has been some progress made. They have been eliminated progressively, but still there is capacity issues. So we need to bring these EU regulations, these EU laws down to an effective implementation stage, that in every region, in every authority that is in charge of giving these permits, be it a region, be it a municipality, that the existing rules, that they are dominated and that they are known, that they're dominated, that they are that there is capacity to apply them, and in a fast way. And then you offered me the chance to give another message. You mentioned before the social transition. And just to round up, actually, this is not a new point, but I wish to insist on why it is so important to limit the technological scope of the Net Zero Industrial Act, to support the Made in Europe requirement, and to support the STEP platform. We mentioned it before. It is not perfect, but the Council should support it, not kill it. And why, in the end? For, of course, all the before-mentioned reasons. But in the end, isn't it for the social dimension? Isn't it essential to maintain jobs? To bring down the costs of clean tech? Thinking of EVs, electric vehicles, for example, other clean tech. Isn't it, I'm asking this question in response to the question asked to the panel of the EU's role in governing geopolitics of net zero transition, isn't it in Europe's interest for businesses, European businesses, to produce locally instead of producing abroad and exporting to Europe? I leave that open to everyone to find their own response.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to open the floor to the audience. I know there are a couple of mics going around, and I'm very tempted to ask Maria Jose to intervene, because I've seen you nodding and saying no as well, but feel free to say no. So here at the front and in the middle as well. Can we have a mic here at the front? Oh, it's. Thank you.
¿No va a hablar ella?
Yep, los dos. Okay. There we go.
Yeah. So it was an excellent discussion. I think there were many things that are very illuminating. But I have to admit that when you touched land use, it hit my heart. It is a very complex sector, and I think one of the problems we had in the last 2 decades is that we had so many lessons to learn, and unfortunately we didn't learn them. So we are continuing to make the same mistakes than 20 years ago. We're going back to the starting point. And Sebastian knows, because we have been working on governance on several sectors, and they were shocked when they saw the global governance of the land use sector, even the forest sector alone, right? So one of the biggest issues now is how you orchestrate all these, which is massive. And the lesson we need to learn in the land use sector is, and in the forest sector in particular, is that we are focusing on the wrong direction. How the sector can contribute to the ambition. And this is a lesson learned for other sectors as well, because it was a debate on REDD+ saying, no, we need capacity, we need investments, and we need to reward, in a way, the success through results-based payments. What happened in the last 20 years is that we gave a lot of capacity, in particular to MRV, to monitor, right? We produce extremely complex and sophisticated monitoring systems with a very large transaction cost. And then we jump from there to use these for giving credibility to the results-based payments. But we forgot about the investments. There's not been any deep thinking about what investments, and what you said, Dagmar, what are the connections with other sectors, how other sectors can be in their transformations, also thinking in terms of how you will reduce deforestation. No? In the case of Brazil, it's also quite interesting because Brazil did their work before even the discussion on forestry was done. It was enforcement of regulation, basically. It was enforcement support by transparency. That was. It was a predecessor of the principles of the Paris Agreement in a way. What happened later is that when the enforcement is weakened at the end of the period of Dilma government, it wasn't even Bolsonaro. The whole thing started even in the latest period of Dilma Rousseff government because enforcements just decay. Then the deforestation increases again. And another thing that I believe we have to keep in mind is that tracing the free deforestation commodities is going to be hell. And we had the risk to overstate the measuring and MRV systems for that and forget about how we will drive and lever the changes. And you're right, the small countries are really worried about that. I had conversations with Colombia and Ecuador, and they are really worried about the traceability of that. Even Ecuador is been sending a project to the Green Climate Fund to develop the systems for traceability and certification, because they're really worried that they don't know how to do that, right? And Brazil has more means to do that, but it's not going to be easy. And we are talking only about 6 commodities. And we are not taking into account that some of the deforestation is driven by poverty, is driven by slash and burn agriculture, is driven by... So unless this is also taken into account, and it's an inclusive process that takes into account also the context where deforestation is happening, the free deforestation commodity is just one element, one single element. It has to be seen in a much broader context. So, I mean, yeah, and I think we need to learn some lessons from the last 20 years on the forestry sector and on the land use sector. And the other point which is fundamental now is that it's a sector which is extremely vulnerable to the increasing climate change impacts. And it is fundamental that we think that the AFOLU sector, the agriculture and forest land use sector, has to decarbonize itself first. And that's very important because there are areas in the agriculture sector that are going to be very difficult to be decarbonized or impossible, right? In the food systems, for example. So, and that's important to keep in mind. I saw some evolution in the mindsets of some scientists in Europe, which I think is promising, and it was something that was thought at the beginning, some years ago when we were dealing with the Kyoto Protocol, which was don't make the targets on the FOLU sector fungible with the targets on other sectors. So, keep the targets separate. At that time, we were just blaming, saying you're crazy. Markets are going to be the key. Tell me the role of markets in the last 20 years in this sector. What was the role they play? Right. So if someone has the answer, I will be very pleased to listen.
Yeah, can I respond directly?
Sure.
Because, yeah, I mean, I've also followed that conversation for more than the last 20 years. I started at the Agriculture Department of OECD and then spent many years at FAO working on developing these CDM methodologies for the land use sector. I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm the worst person from my team. We have obviously Brazilians, Colombians, Ecuadorians on my team who would be so much better at representing what I'm trying to say is, what we're trying to say is, yes, we need to tackle income opportunities in rural areas. I mean, we need to tackle poverty. That's exactly what I said before when I said a bit stupidly maybe, what is in it for Lula's people? And I mean, that is what I mean. We can translate this new commodity, which is information. This is exactly what I'm saying. This is exactly one of these ideas. Can we generate additional revenue streams? And not through offsets, but I mean through a new commodity, which is data. I think that is a really worthwhile opportunity to pursue because the demand is there. We have created the demand with regulation for ESG data. Now I think a lot of people could provide it. Secondly, traceability. I mean, we have really come a very, very long way. I mean, if you also have followed this the last 20 years, it's amazing. Just in terms of computing power and satellite coverage and what we can do with the satellite imagery today is totally different. I mean, I did GIS 25 years ago, longer, it doesn't matter. we're in a totally different ballgame today where we can do it. And initiatives like Trace, Global Canopy, Forest 500, they're really doing, I think, they have come a long way, I think, in improving traceability. It's just that now we need, I think, some of the missing pieces, which is obviously these, the trading connections. What happens, say, in Indonesia before the mill, yeah, before it goes to the mill and becomes palm oil. That is a regulatory piece. It's not difficult to report, but people are not reporting it. It's a perfect example of the complementarity of regulation and technological solutions that have been elaborated by people like Trace, I think. It's just that we need to think of making people on the ground part of that supply chain. Yeah, I think it would be worth, it's probably a bit too exotic as a discussion now, but I mean, it would be very interesting to continue that because I think that is really important. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So we're going to collect 3 questions, 4 questions, no, 5. Okay, we're going to start with a round of 3. So yeah, lady in the middle, and then gentleman at the front, and then, yeah, in turn.
Okay, thanks so much. I really appreciated the talks that you all gave. My question relates to something that Ingmar said and also Isabel mentioned, related to we can't afford fragmentation, is what you said, Ingmar, and that we can't have each country doing everything, right? And at the same time, Isabel talked about local production. And so we're talking about the need for efficiencies, and also we need to support local production and SMEs, right? So how do we reconcile these two things, both within and between different countries? So, you know, small or medium-sized enterprises may not be able to compete at the same scale as large enterprises. And, you know, just as one example, like small agricultural producers in Spain versus the large ones, it's really, really difficult for them to compete. And then what are the EU policies doing, right? Are we trying to support the local production, or are we trying to support efficiency and lower consumer prices? And so, you know, in my research, I've found, for example, that small farmers really don't feel supported by EU policies, at least in the Basque Country in Spain, so maybe not in all of Spain. And also kind of maybe the inequalities, if we think about efficiency, and we think about the powerhouse that is Germany, for example, industry-wise, and that farmers in Spain rely on German inputs for their crops and German machinery, and it's almost unaffordable for them. And that, you know, on a global scale also, this efficiency will create power imbalances between countries, and that countries don't really want to give up that power on like a global scale either. And of course we can, you know, think and hope for cooperation, but, you know, I was kind of interested in what the panelists think, how that realistically could pan out, and also, yeah, just your thoughts on this issue, kind of this.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to be brief so that we can get everyone in. Can I have a mic here for the gentleman at the front? And again, we're going to collect rounds of 3. If you can also introduce yourself so that we know who's posing the question, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
So Miles Allen, University of Oxford. I just have to agree very wholeheartedly with what Maria just said about separate targets for land use and fossil emissions. We have to stop deforestation because we have to stop deforestation, not by pretending it somehow compensates for continued use of fossil fuels. I had a completely different question, but inspired by what Maria just said, I really would like the panel's thoughts on the prospects for separating biological from geological carbon in EU policy and setting separate targets for land use emissions and a sustainable land use, both at the supply chain level and also within the EU, and preventing fossil fuels from causing further global warming through the phase out of, well, this is where the word abated might come in, phase out of unabated use of fossil fuels.
Thank you very much.
Hope that was short enough.
Yep, absolutely. Perfect. Fantastic. I know I have Mario there in the middle, and there's a lady in the front, but yeah, I'll take that third one. Oh, okay.
I go?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Yorgos, and I represent Ecometro. The question is that according to Climate Action Network Europe, due to its report of last year, we are, as a European Union, we are out of targets in comparison to our Paris Agreement. We made a Fit for 55 that uplifted the ambition to 55% of emissions cut, but according to the network, to be in line with our Paris Agreement, we should go to 65% for 2030 and to be decarbonized in 2040. We know that we are not doing many things on ETS. Our natural sinks in LULUCF are losing potential, and then in the other part, in transport or in buildings, we are still lack of ambitions. So I would like to have the opinion, the view of the panel on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've just been told we have 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask you to be super quick in those answers, because I do want to get to the last questions. Thank you so much. Anyone take any of the questions?
I go for local context and fragmentation. I think this is a huge debate, and I think we need a nuanced debate there. For instance, also goes for critical materials. Are we willing to obtain 10% of lithium in Spain, for instance? I mean, there's huge opposition to this. Or is it wiser to wait, to look for, more sustainable paths of interdependence with other countries? Again, this is comparative advantage. If we, and I remember you that we are speaking about open strategic autonomy. Open strategic autonomy. So if we are very much restrictive, and I agree with that, on value chain, we are going to make the transition much more expensive. All this obsession in the US with China and asking for decoupling, I don't think we Europeans should follow this such neatly. Does it mean that we don't have to replicate IRA? In some parts, yes, but for instance, batteries. I've seen the other day, this is a huge investment run in southern Kansas, all the lithium belt there. American companies are heavily investing there because they got the resource, they got the experience, mining got public acceptance in the region, and so on and so forth. If you want to replicate that, I mean, there is no IRA in Europe that can make those lithium resources be exploited as fast and quickly as the Americans. So we got limitations in our local context requirements, but further fragmenting value chains will make it more expensive. Should we get some kind of reshoring or try to, reform our energy interdependence pattern? Yes, I think we should. It will take time. It will take time. But some things will be unattainable. And in some respects, probably undesirable. I know nuclear is not included in the strategy. Uranium is not included in the mineral strategy. In any case, if our French friends want to still betting on nuclear, are you going to ask to the Hungarians or the Czechs, who have suffered the hugest environmental degradation due to uranium mining, that they have to provide 10% of our uranium supply? I think this is. I think there are serious limitations on the implementation on local context in some minerals, in some value chains, and I think we have to be very careful on that. And especially, we have to be inclusive with those countries with which we have free trade areas. Because if we do not include the Moroccan, all these guys, the Brazilian and all that, I think that won't be a positive sum game, in my opinion.
Thank you. Do you want to very quickly respond to any of the questions? We are almost out of time, so you're going to have... Yes, so...
Would.
Uh,
But maybe we can also first hear the other questions and then we do a final round. That's better.
Okay, well...
I don't know if you only have 2 minutes or what.
We have,
Did you wanna-
we have quite a... Yeah, 2 minutes to answer, yeah.
No. Yeah, okay, but I mean, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I actually didn't understand everything you were saying because I was too slow or you were too fast. I don't know. But and you said a lot of things. So but on this making it work for SMEs, as I understood, and fragmentation versus local. Yeah, I'm obviously out of my fan. I'm myself as a fan of sustainable supply chain regulation, much more than fragmentation and reshoring. Yeah. But we cannot continue if we don't have a level playing field and we just continue with supply chains that are intransparent about the impact that we are having upstream and where we have no engagement. Again, does the Spanish presidency want to go down in history as the one presidency that missed the opportunity to finally put incentives in place for financial institutions to take action about these supply chain impacts? If not, then change it. Yeah, I think this is more pragmatic. This is, we want to continue with the supply chains. We want to continue trading because we need the comparative advantage. We need competition, for Christ's sake. There's so much we need to invest. This is not going to happen if everybody does it themselves. Yeah. So, but then we need to obviously tackle at the same time the sustainability destruction upstream. The second bit on the SMEs, I think now, particularly in the agriculture sector, a very interesting presentation I heard in Bucharest at the Climate Summit a few weeks ago by Auchan, a big French retailer, where retailers are taking responsibility, and I think we have to push them, force them, and maybe regulate them, to take responsibility to help these small farmers in their supply chain to be able to cope, be it with the reporting requirements, but also with the transformation. And I think a lot of the companies at least are pretending to do it because they're under a lot of pressure. I think we should keep the pressure on the big stock market, publicly listed companies like Nestle and Unilever, the food industry, and the big retailers, because they also have the capital to invest in this kind of in this transition that small farmers don't have. But they have the responsibility because, again, the bulk of the value added does not stay with the farmer. It stays with the retailer. So that's also where the responsibility lies. That maybe as a quick attempt to answer that question. And the second question, the separating emissions, I don't know legally speaking, but what are we doing? At the moment, we are, with the deforestation-free products regulation, we are targeting, totally independent of that whole conversation about carbon emissions, we're tackling that deforestation in and of itself. And I think that is probably a pragmatic way of going about it, even though it's only 7 commodities, even though these 7 commodities probably represent 68% of global deforestation, which is not a bad start.
Thank you. Isabel?
Thanks. Quickly, on open strategic autonomy, Gonzalo, we agreed. It's agreed. We need to rely on strategic partnerships to source some raw materials, but one is not exclusive of the other. The point I was trying to make is that the Net Zero Industrial Act is an opportunity for Europe to foster clean tech production and the whole value chain. Second, on agriculture needing to be prioritized as a sector for decarbonization, I apologize, I must disagree, not only because I work for a transport organization, but also because transport emissions are expected to make up 40% of CO2 emissions in 2030. This is the biggest chunk that needs to be tackled. And then on the separate targets for biological, non-biological targets, here, pardon? What I know so far is that we already have them, the RFNBO targets for shipping and aviation. They are very modest, but within RED they have been, and the different sectoral legislations, my colleague Collars, who is here, will be happy to answer detailed questions. But so there is a debut. We need to raise it.
Thank you. Sebastian, I want to give you the opportunity to reflect on any of these in 30 seconds, if I may. Sorry, apologies.
I'll try my best. I very much like the thought, I think, that Isabel brought forward, that is, we need to prioritize. So let that be my guiding theme for the 3 points that I want to raise. So priorities would be, rather than complaining all the time that 55% is not enough, which it is not, let's acknowledge that, to actually get there. All the current scenarios tell us that not enough is happening and that there is rollback in several member states where the measures are not taken to actually get there. So that would be my first priority, to actually get there, and remember that it says at least 55, so we can go beyond. Second, I think priority would be circularity. Advancing on resource efficiency, making that a priority. And third, kind of coming back to my initial intervention, in view of the backlash that we are facing, I think, and we're just seeing the beginning of it, I'm afraid, building societal and political support in the member states, in cities, in regions, etc. We really need to think about that and how we can build the systems also at the European level, as I said, to support that. Because otherwise we can sit here and discuss what needs to happen, and it's not going to happen. I think that's the basis of it. That was more than 30 seconds, I apologize. Thanks very much for having me.
That was a fantastic way to end. I really apologize. We're going to take your questions perhaps during the coffee break after. And I would just like to thank all the panelists. It's been a very, very interesting session, and just a few points to end. The ongoing desire by the European Union to remain a directional leader and a bridge builder, a shrinking emitter that seeks climate policy followership, in search of competitiveness and security. I think we've mentioned that indirectly, and perhaps it will be mentioned in following sessions or in the final discussion. And in a very critically complex environment, you've talked about, Sebastian, the need to stop the rollback. I think perhaps we have to start thinking about buffers aside from pathways to get to our goals, because we are going to have to be lenient at times of uncertainty, but we need to keep that final goal, that net zero goal, in mind. The need for bilateral cooperation and mutual learning, the sustainability criteria, and the need to strengthen partnerships, and the opportunity for this strengthening in the southern neighbourhood and the LAC region. And with that, thank you very much. It has been an absolute pleasure and honour.